The Cumberland forests had long learned how to keep secrets. Fog clung to the ravines like old breath, and the trees leaned inward as if listening for something they had buried but never forgotten. When the child was born, no birds cried out, no insect stirred. The silence was so complete it felt deliberate, as though the woods themselves were holding back a scream. The midwife fled before dawn. She would later swear the infant's skin sloughed beneath her fingers like wet bark, that the smell in the cabin was not blood but rot pulled fresh from the earth. By the time the father returned, the woman was gone, and the child lay wrapped in linen already stained dark, his chest rising and falling with stubborn, unnatural patience. They named him anyway. The boy did not cry much. When he did, it sounded muffled, as if his lungs were lined with soil. His flesh bore bruised hues that never faded, greys, greens, the dull yellow of old bone left too long in damp places. The skin along his spine split and healed in cycles, peeling and sealing like a wound that could not decide whether to live or die. By his 3rd year, it was clear he was not sick. Sickness moves toward an end. This was something else. The decay did not advance, but neither did it retreat. It simply waited, coiled beneath his skin, patient and intimate. The forest responded first. Deer paths rerouted themselves. Mushrooms bloomed in rings near the cabin, thick and pallid, their caps veined like exposed organs. At night, the trees creaked with a sound too rhythmic to be wind, and the boy would wake knowing, without understanding, that the noise was meant for him. Sometimes, when his joints locked or his fingers split and bled dark, syrupy fluid, he felt memories that were not his own. A weight pressing down from above. Roots threading through muscle. The comfort of being still for decades while something else wore his shape. He did not yet know that his body was inherited. Only that it was remembering. The child's birth did not unfold as births normally did, with noise and urgency and the sharp insistence of life announcing itself. It happened quietly, buried deep within a forgotten pocket of the Cumberland forests where the trees pressed close enough to block the sky and the ground stayed perpetually damp, even in drought. The cabin had been used before, generations earlier, though no records named it, and whatever once occupied it had left behind more than dust. When the labor began, the air inside grew heavy and sour, carrying a smell that suggested meat left too long in earth rather than the metallic tang of blood. The midwife noticed first that the mother's cries sounded wrong, as if something inside her resisted being born, clinging stubbornly to an older place. When the child emerged, the rot was already there. It was not fresh or spreading but settled, ingrained, like wood that had decayed and hardened simultaneously. The skin sagged in places where no newborn skin should, mottled with colors more often seen on corpses pulled from water. His chest rose slowly, with effort, each breath sounding thick, yet his heartbeat was strong, deliberate, unconcerned with the state of the flesh housing it. The umbilical cord crumbled when cut, breaking apart like dried root fibers rather than living tissue. The midwife's hands shook as she cleaned him, because pieces of skin sloughed away under the cloth, revealing not raw muscle but more layers of altered flesh beneath, as though decay had been built inward over time. No explanation could contain what she was seeing. This was not disease, not deformity, not the result of starvation or poison. It felt older than the woman who birthed him, older than the cabin, older than the path that led there. The child did not wail as expected. His mouth opened, but the sound that came out was low and dampened, as if it traveled through packed soil before reaching the air. His eyes opened briefly, clouded but alert, reflecting the firelight with an awareness that unsettled everyone in the room. By dawn, the midwife was gone, leaving her bag and refusing payment, crossing herself repeatedly as she disappeared into the trees. Word never spread beyond whispers because the forest itself seemed to swallow sound that day. The father, staring at the infant, felt a confusion deeper than fear, because the child was alive without question, warm and breathing, yet carried the unmistakable presence of something that should have finished dying long ago. Even as the mother slept, exhausted and pale, the boy lay still, his body emanating a faint, earthen heat. The slow, patient warmth of decomposition paused mid-process, as though whatever claimed him had decided the time was not yet right. The community nearest to the cabin did not react with shock so much as recognition, the kind that settles in the gut before the mind has time to argue. These were people accustomed to patterns older than law or reason, and when the whispers reached them of a child born already touched by rot, of a smell that clung to the air long after the midwife fled, they did not ask to see proof. They remembered stories spoken softly during winter nights, warnings about the forest answering blood with inheritance, about flesh that did not belong solely to the present. By unspoken agreement, they decided the boy would not be brought into town, not for blessing, not for examination, not even for burial should he die. The decision was framed as mercy, though it carried the weight of fear. Visits to the cabin became rare and careful. When food was delivered, it was left on the edge of the clearing, never handed directly to the father. No one crossed the threshold once it was rumored that the walls had begun to sweat during the night, dark streaks appearing like veins beneath the warped wood. Those who had seen the child spoke of how his presence made their skin crawl, not because he was monstrous, but because he felt misplaced, like something unearthed too early. The elders advised silence, insisting that naming such things too clearly invited attention, and attention was dangerous in a forest that listened. The hiding was not merely physical. Records were altered or allowed to rot in forgotten filing drawers. The birth went unregistered. The mother's death months later was attributed to fever, and no mention was made of the infant who survived her. Children were warned away from the trails leading toward the cabin, told stories of sinkholes and wild men rather than the truth. Even prayers avoided the area, spoken with careful omission, as though divinity itself might recoil if directed too precisely. What truly sealed the community's resolve were the small signs that followed. Crops closest to the forest edge failed inexplicably, soil turning sour despite proper tending. Livestock refused to drink from certain streams, and when forced, grew sick. Hunters found game already dead, half buried and fused with roots, as though the earth had claimed them prematurely. Each incident was minor enough to dismiss, yet together they formed a pattern that mirrored the old warnings too closely to ignore. The boy was not simply cursed, he was a marker, a boundary made of living flesh. So they protected themselves through concealment. By pretending the child did not exist, they believed they could limit the reach of whatever had followed him into the world. Guilt was swallowed along with fear, justified by survival and the hope that isolation might keep the decay contained. The father learned quickly that questions would bring only closed faces and lowered eyes. He understood, without being told, that the boy's safety depended on remaining unseen, unspoken, and unacknowledged beyond the trees. In hiding the child, the community was not attempting cruelty, but containment, treating the boy's very existence as a wound that must be covered and left undisturbed, because probing it risked reopening something buried long before any of them were born. As the boy grew, the expected progression toward death never arrived. The decay that had marked him at birth did not deepen into collapse or infection, nor did it spread in the way rot was meant to. Instead, it settled into a strange equilibrium, as though his body had reached an agreement with the condition that inhabited it. The flesh remained discolored and uneven, but it hardened where it should have softened, tightening around bone rather than sloughing away. Scabs formed and sealed instead of breaking open, and when skin peeled, it revealed layers beneath that were oddly intact, preserved by some internal logic no living anatomy should have possessed. By his 5th year, the boy could run, though not for long, and his gait was stiff, accompanied by faint cracking sounds from joints that did not fully bend. Pain came to him in distant waves rather than sharp immediacy, as if his nerves were partially disconnected from urgency. Fevers never took hold, infections never lingered. When he cut himself, the blood was thick and dark but ceased flowing quickly, clotting with unnatural efficiency. The father watched in constant expectation of sudden collapse, preparing himself daily for the moment the body would finally fail, but the moment never came. What frightened him most was the consistency. Living bodies change rapidly in childhood, but the boy remained eerily stable. His height increased slowly, unevenly, as if growth occurred in spurts dictated by something other than nutrition or age. His face carried no clear resemblance to either parent, settling instead into a structure that felt borrowed, assembled with the wrong intent. Teeth erupted late and darkened quickly, yet they were strong, resistant to cracking, as though carved rather than grown. The boy himself began to notice the difference, though he lacked the language to describe it. He did not feel fragile the way other children did. When he fell, he did not fear injury. When he bruised, the marks lingered but did not worsen. There was a sense of being held together by something external, an unseen framework that compensated for the rot by reinforcing what remained. Sleep brought dreams of stillness rather than movement, of lying pressed into cool earth while time passed overhead unnoticed. Neighbors who glimpsed him from a distance remarked on how wrong it felt to see a child whose body bore the signature of death yet behaved with the stubborn resilience of something designed to endure. The decay was no longer an illness but a condition, stable and self-sustaining. It did not threaten his life, it defined it. The boy was not dying slowly, nor was he recovering. He was existing in a state that belonged neither to the living nor the dead, as though the rot itself had learned to live through him, adapting, reinforcing, and preserving its vessel in preparation for a purpose that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with waiting. The forest reacted long before the people fully understood what they were witnessing. It began subtly, in ways that could be dismissed as seasonal shifts or poor luck, but the changes followed the boy's growth too closely to ignore. Animals altered their paths first. Deer tracks that once crisscrossed the land near the cabin faded and reappeared miles away, as if the herd had collectively decided certain ground was no longer safe to tread. Birds avoided the trees closest to the clearing, their nests abandoned despite plentiful food, leaving branches unnaturally bare and silent even in spring. Insects gathered in dense, sluggish swarms at the forest's edge, refusing to cross an invisible threshold that only the boy seemed able to breach without hesitation. The trees themselves showed signs of unease. Bark darkened in irregular patterns, as though bruised from within, and long fissures opened along trunks that should have been healthy. From these splits oozed sap that ran thicker than normal, staining the ground a deep, tar-like black before hardening into brittle, resinous scars. The scent carried on the air was sharp and bitter, clinging to clothes and hair long after anyone left the area. Moss grew in heavy, choking mats around the roots, smothering undergrowth and turning the forest floor slick and unstable, as if the earth were sweating. The boy sensed these changes instinctively. He walked through the altered woods without fear, touching the wounded bark and sticky sap with careful curiosity. Where his fingers brushed the trees, the sap flowed more freely, pulsing faintly, as though responding to recognition. On certain nights, when the air hung thick and damp, the forest creaked and shifted in patterns too deliberate to be coincidence. Roots rose closer to the surface, twisting and knotting like tendons beneath skin, reshaping the ground around the cabin into uneven ridges that made approach difficult. Those who ventured near spoke of a pressure that built in the chest, a subtle resistance in the air that made breathing feel labored. Compasses spun uselessly, and familiar paths seemed to stretch or contract, turning short walks into hours-long disorientations. Sound behaved strangely as well. Voices carried poorly, swallowed after a few feet, while distant snapping branches echoed unnaturally close, creating the sense of being surrounded by movement that never quite revealed itself. The forest was not decaying in the same way as the boy's flesh, but it was adapting, reorganizing itself around his presence. Healthy growth gave way to something denser, more compact, as if the land were tightening its grip on itself. Fungi bloomed in grotesque abundance, pale and swollen, releasing clouds of spores that coated leaves and stones alike. Even the soil darkened, growing rich and loamy in places that had once been dry and thin. It became clear that the forest was not recoiling from the boy but responding, reshaping itself to accommodate him, as though recognizing a familiar pattern returning after a long absence and slowly preparing the ground for something that had been promised and delayed for far too long. The discovery began accidentally, through the kind of curiosity that grows in isolation and feeds on unanswered questions. The boy had learned early that there were places in the cabin he was not meant to touch, not because his father forbade them outright, but because his voice tightened whenever the floorboards near the back room creaked. That room smelled different from the rest of the cabin, sharper and older, like paper left too long in damp earth. One afternoon, while his father was gone longer than expected, the boy pried loose a warped plank and uncovered a shallow space beneath the floor, packed tightly with oilcloth-wrapped bundles swollen by moisture and time. The journals inside were written in several hands, some neat and deliberate, others frantic, the ink bleeding where pages had been pressed against the ground. Dates overlapped in impossible ways, generations folding in on themselves. The earliest entries spoke of a body recovered rather than born, pulled from beneath a collapsed hillside after a landslide exposed something that should not have been intact. The writer described flesh that did not respond to age, that resisted decay even as it bore the unmistakable signs of long burial. Later entries shifted in tone, recording attempts to inhabit that flesh, to animate it, to use it as a vessel when sickness or age made the writer's own body unreliable. As the boy read, a creeping familiarity settled in his chest. Descriptions of scars, discolorations, and structural oddities matched his own body with unsettling precision. One journal contained crude sketches of a spine reinforced with unnatural density, of organs positioned slightly wrong but functioning regardless, of skin layers thicker than human anatomy allowed. The writers did not speak of possession in the way the boy expected. Instead, they referred to inheritance, to continuity, to flesh that could be passed down when prepared correctly. Consciousness, they believed, was transient. The body was the true constant. The realization arrived not as shock but as recognition. Memories stirred that were not memories at all, impressions rising from somewhere deep within his tissues. He felt the weight of earth pressing against ribs, the slow compression of decades, the muffled sense of waiting while seasons passed unnoticed above. These sensations were not frightening. They were comforting in their familiarity, as though his body was recalling a time when stillness had been its purpose. One entry, written in a hand he recognized as his father's, ended abruptly. It spoke of regret and necessity in the same breath, of love twisted into obligation. The boy understood then that his consciousness was new, fragile and temporary, layered atop something far older and more patient. His body had lived before him, not as metaphor or myth, but as literal history embedded in sinew and bone. He was not merely suffering from an inherited condition, he was occupying a structure designed to endure collapse, repaired and reinforced across generations for a reason that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what waited beneath the forest to be whole again. Understanding did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, in fragments that surfaced during moments when the boy was least prepared to confront them. After reading the journals, he began to notice subtle dissonances between thought and sensation, as though his mind occupied a space slightly offset from the body it controlled. Certain movements felt rehearsed rather than learned. His hands sometimes reached for tools he had never used, arranging them with practiced efficiency before he consciously registered what he was doing. When startled, his body reacted not with panic but with a stillness that felt ancient, a reflex shaped by long periods of immobility rather than flight. Sleep became the place where truth pressed closest. Dreams no longer followed the logic of imagination but arrived as compressed experiences, heavy with physical awareness. He dreamed of being carried by strangers whose faces never resolved, of being lowered into dark spaces where the air grew cooler and pressure increased steadily. There was no fear in these dreams, only patience. Time passed differently there, measured in weight and silence rather than minutes. He would wake with his muscles aching, as though they had held the memory of compression too long, and with the lingering sense that the body had been somewhere else while his mind slept. Gradually, he understood the distinction that the journals had hinted at. His thoughts, his doubts, his questions belonged to him alone, recent and delicate, shaped by isolation and curiosity. But the flesh responded to stimuli with an authority that bypassed conscious intent. It recognized certain smells, certain vibrations in the ground, with a familiarity he could not explain. When storms rolled through the forest, his joints stiffened in anticipation before the thunder arrived, reacting to shifts in pressure that his mind had not yet noticed. Hunger felt optional, pain negotiable, as though the body prioritized endurance over comfort. The realization that his consciousness was temporary settled heavily but without despair. He began to see himself as a surface phenomenon, a brief current passing through a structure built to persist. The body did not resist him, but it did not belong to him either. It carried its own momentum, its own history of use and reuse, shaped by intentions that predated his awareness. In moments of stillness, he felt an internal pull, not toward death, but toward surrender, as if yielding control would allow the body to resume a long-interrupted task. This knowledge altered how he perceived choice. Actions felt less like decisions and more like negotiations between impulse and inheritance. He could think, plan, hesitate, but beneath those processes was a steady pressure guiding him toward particular paths, particular places within the forest. The body remembered routes the mind had never traveled, inclinations etched into muscle and bone rather than thought. He began to suspect that his consciousness existed not to command the flesh, but to witness its return, to provide awareness during a phase that required observation rather than control, because whatever the body was moving toward did not need a mind to function, only a vessel capable of remembering how to endure long enough to arrive there. As the years passed, the forest's changes accelerated in ways that mirrored the boy's own physical deterioration, though neither could be described as simple decay. His movements grew slower, more deliberate, as if his body conserved itself for moments of necessity rather than routine action. Joints locked for hours at a time before releasing with dull, grinding sounds that echoed faintly through the trees. The skin along his arms thickened and darkened further, splitting and sealing in complex patterns that resembled growth rings rather than wounds. Each alteration seemed to correspond with a shift in the surrounding land, as though the forest were responding to signals broadcast from his body at a level deeper than sight or sound. Trees nearest the cabin began to lean inward, their trunks bending despite the absence of strong wind, roots pushing up from the soil in slow, deliberate arcs. What had once been clear ground became a tangled mass of exposed wood and earth, making passage increasingly difficult. The boy noticed that when his joints seized painfully, the forest floor around him hardened, soil compacting into dense, almost stone-like patches. When his skin split and wept dark fluid, rain followed within days, saturating the land until runoff carved new channels through the undergrowth. The connection grew impossible to deny when the forest began to replicate aspects of his condition. Bark peeled in long, ragged strips from trees that remained otherwise alive, revealing darker layers beneath. Fungus spread in stratified bands up trunks and across fallen logs, mirroring the layered structure of his own flesh. In certain areas, the ground collapsed into shallow depressions that filled with stagnant water, emitting the same sour-sweet odor that clung to his body during periods of intense change. It was as though the forest was rehearsing the same process of controlled collapse and reinforcement, learning from the example he provided. The boy felt this synchronization as a constant pressure, a tightening thread connecting his internal state to the land. When exhaustion overtook him, the forest fell unnaturally quiet, even the wind withdrawing as if to preserve energy. When a surge of internal strength followed, brief and inexplicable, growth responded with startling speed, vines advancing overnight, saplings breaking through ground that had been barren the day before. These were not coincidences but exchanges, signals passed back and forth in a language older than both of them. Observers, few as they were, spoke of the forest as though it were becoming a single organism, its boundaries less defined, its behaviors increasingly unified. Paths closed without warning, swallowed by sudden growth or collapse. Landmarks shifted subtly, making maps unreliable. The boy's body, too, lost clear distinctions, scars blurring into one another, features settling into a form that felt less individual and more functional. Identity, both personal and environmental, seemed to erode in tandem. What emerged from this shared transformation was not chaos but alignment. The forest was not dying alongside the boy, it was adjusting its structure to match his pace of change. Together, they moved toward a state of readiness, shedding what was unnecessary and reinforcing what endured. The boy sensed that this convergence was a prelude rather than an end, that the accelerated collapse was not leading toward disappearance but toward a moment when both body and land would reach a condition that allowed something long delayed to finally proceed, because neither the forest nor the flesh could complete what they were meant to do until they had learned to fail and rebuild in the same rhythm. The disappearances began subtly, almost imperceptibly, but their pattern quickly drew attention from those who dared to venture near the edges of the forest. Hunters returned late or not at all, leaving behind abandoned rifles and splintered carts, their tracks vanishing abruptly as though the earth itself had swallowed them. Families noticed neighbors missing for days, only to discover traces later, fragments of clothing snagged on roots, hair embedded in moss, or a faint, unnatural smell lingering near creeks and depressions. No one could explain how people could vanish so completely, leaving only evidence that suggested movement, struggle, and yet finality all at once. It was as if the forest, or something within it, had begun to claim what had been set apart for its own purposes. The boy became aware of these events with an unsettling clarity. He felt tremors in the soil, subtle vibrations that traveled along his bones rather than through the air, signaling the passage of something large, deliberate, and inexorable. Sometimes he would see glimpses of figures moving through the trees at night, too shadowed to identify, slipping closer and then disappearing behind trunks as if the forest itself bent to hide them. The phenomena were not always violent, yet the outcome was always the same. The missing were never returned, only marked in absence and in the sporadic, unnatural rearrangement of the terrain. Closer inspection revealed horrifying details. Occasionally, remnants of the missing were found fused with the earth. A leg partially buried and overgrown with roots, an arm encased in hardened sap, a torso compressed into the soil so that the contours of human anatomy were visible through layers of moss and sediment. The bodies were never whole, and yet they were not destroyed. The transformation was deliberate, as though the forest was reconstructing them into some other state, using human flesh as material to extend its own reach. The rot and regeneration that characterized the boy's body seemed mirrored in these acts, decay paired with preservation, breakdown entwined with structural reinvention. Locals whispered that the boy's presence was the cause, that his inherited body acted as a magnet or conduit for the forest's will. The connection seemed plausible, the timing was too precise to dismiss. Every disappearance coincided with periods of intensified change in the boy's flesh, when his rot advanced slightly before retracting, when his joints stiffened and he seemed to pulse with the subtle rhythm of something much older. Observers noted that the soil where the missing were found bore the same pallor and dense texture that clung to the boy, as though his condition extended outward, infecting or informing the land itself. The unnerving pattern forced families to withdraw, leaving the edges of the forest eerily silent. Trails grew over, fences collapsed, and livestock avoided grazing near the cabin. It became clear that the forest was not merely responding to the boy's presence but actively incorporating others into a process it had been conducting for decades, one that mirrored the slow collapse and reconstruction of flesh. The boy understood, on some level that was more instinct than reason, that these events were not accidents. They were rehearsals, fragments of a larger, inevitable convergence in which human presence could be subsumed, transformed, and finally integrated into the same rhythm that governed his own body and the slowly reshaping forest surrounding him. The truth came gradually, slipping into the boy's awareness in fragments that were at once horrifying and oddly logical. For years he had believed his flesh was deteriorating, that each split, each darkened patch, each creeping stiffness was a symptom of a body failing under the weight of its own corruption. He measured his life in these cycles, in the moments when the rot advanced and receded, and the forest's mirrored growth and decay seemed only coincidental, a reflection rather than a cause. But as he grew, the forest's responses became too precise, too deliberate to ignore. The trees did not merely shift or lean, they seemed to brace, to prepare, to accommodate something that was returning. The soil, once soft and forgiving, hardened in places only when his joints locked. The fungi that spread like pale veins along the forest floor pulsed faintly with a rhythm that matched the subtle pressures within his own limbs. Memories that were not his own pressed insistently against his mind, layered beneath the awareness of self. He saw images of the earth itself rising and folding around something buried, of roots twisting to claim space, of dark hollows opening beneath moss and stone. His body, he realized, was not failing in the way he had been taught to fear. It was returning to a prior condition, a state that had existed long before his consciousness occupied it. The rot was not random, it was deliberate, a restoration of structure, a recalibration of flesh to meet some latent design encoded in the tissue itself. The slow collapse, the strange equilibrium, the body's ability to resist death while still decaying, these were not signs of weakness but evidence of readiness. He began to perceive himself as a vessel, a temporary steward of flesh that carried history deep within it, a body that had been intended for something larger than survival. The forest, the disappearances, the cycles of decay in his own limbs, all of it aligned toward a singular purpose that extended beyond thought or desire. He felt the pull of inevitability as an almost physical pressure, a gravity originating from below, from soil and root and fungus. The land had been waiting for him, and through him, for the full realization of what had been laid out centuries before. There was no malice in this knowledge, only inevitability. The boy's fear of collapse gave way to comprehension. His body had always been meant to endure, to participate in a cycle that transcended his perception of life and death. The forest's changes, the vanished people, The strange resonance between flesh and soil, all of it was preparation. The understanding came in a quiet, chilling moment when the wind ceased in the canopy and the soil beneath him seemed to pulse in recognition. He was not rotting toward oblivion, he was returning to a state designed to awaken something older, something patient and deliberate, something that had been lying dormant beneath the Cumberland forests, waiting for the vessel capable of completing what had been set in motion long before his first breath. The boy came to understand that choice, in the way others understood it, was an illusion. His flesh had been prepared, honed by centuries of inheritance, shaped to endure collapse and reconstruct itself in a rhythm that did not belong to the mind but to the body and the earth beneath it. The pull toward the forest was irresistible, a current running through him that could not be resisted without cost. Every step he took along the winding trails, every moment his joints locked or his skin split, seemed to sync with the land, as though the Cumberland forests themselves waited for him to make a decision. Yet the decision was not truly his, it was whether to resist or to yield, whether to interrupt a cycle far older than his consciousness or allow it to complete its course. Resistance brought strain. When he attempted to step away from the densest woods, a pressure would rise in his chest, subtle but unyielding, and the rot within him would surge, spreading to areas that had been stable for years. It was as though the body itself disapproved, enforcing the inheritance with mechanical precision. The forest responded in kind. Branches would twist into paths that led him back, roots shifted overnight to block the trails he sought to take, and in the darkest nights, he would hear whispers, low, reverberating, composed of wind, sap, and unidentifiable movement that reminded him he was not separate from the land. Yielding, however, demanded surrender. It required that he observe, that he allow the slow, deliberate processes of decay and reconstruction to proceed without interference. It required patience and the acceptance of a role that was older than memory, one he had never truly chosen but had been born into nonetheless. The boy felt the tension between mind and body grow until it became a single, oppressive weight. Each day brought him closer to the point where he would have to commit fully, where the cycles of collapse and preparation would no longer pause for hesitation. He could sense the forest's readiness, the way soil and root pulsed in anticipation, how fungi arranged themselves in concentric, rhythmic patterns as though counting down the final stages of a process that had begun long before his first breath. The vanished people, the bruised earth, the strange stability of his own rot, all of it pointed to a moment of culmination, a junction where choice would solidify into action. He began to understand that yielding would not mean destruction. The inheritance was not a curse in the sense he had feared, nor was resistance truly salvation. The body he inhabited was a bridge, and the forest's transformations were preparatory, not punitive. To resist fully would invite failure, not freedom. To yield was to complete what his flesh had always been built to endure. Somewhere in that realization, the line between self and vessel blurred. Consciousness mattered less than presence. Observation mattered less than synchronization. And the final decision, when it came, would not be about life or death, it would be about whether he would let the forest reclaim him as its final vessel, allowing the inheritance embedded in flesh and soil to reach the conclusion it had waited centuries to achieve.